And to conclude this session, we have Margo Schwadron. Dr. Schwadron is an archaeologist with the National Park Service's Southeast Archaeological Center and is the Regional NAGPRA Coordinator and Division Chief for NAGPRA and Applied Science. Her research takes a landscape approach to archaeology, integrating paleoenvironmental and paleoclimate research and applying science to document and protect vulnerable sites from climate change impacts. And when she concludes, I will ask that our other speakers from this session go up to the stage for a Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to bring us back down south to the Everglades. This case study details a new important example of prehistoric hunter-fisher-gatherers from the 10,000 Islands region of the Everglades, Florida. As the largest subtropical wilderness in the U.S., the Everglades are an unparalleled landscape which provides important habitats for numerous rare and endangered species. The Everglades are an international treasure, recognized as a World Heritage Site environmentally, an International Biosphere Reserve, and a wetland of international importance. While the natural and environmental significance of the Everglades have long been recognized, the human history of the Everglades is much less understood. This study fills an important gap in understanding the role of humans within this rich ecosystem and stands as an excellent example of a prehistoric maritime cultural landscape. Studies of shell midden sites typically focus on diet, subsistence, and paleoenvironmental studies, with the normative and long-standing view of shell middens as domestic refuse, simply the remains of daily meals discarded in garbage piles. However, recent work by some researchers have challenged this idea, and discussed today by Jeff and Matt and Ken. We've expanded our interpretations to beyond these strictly garbage pile contexts. This case study examines a little-known but significant type of shell midden site called shellworks, which are among the world's largest, most complex prehistoric shell-built landscapes ever known. They deserve far more consideration beyond the simple garbage pile perspective. Shellworks are complex sites and were socially constructed landscapes that reflect a unique maritime hunter-gatherer adaptation and tradition of shell construction. These shellwork sites represent some of the world's best examples of prehistoric maritime cultural landscapes, as their preservation is unparalleled. Preserved in almost their entirety, the 10,000 Islands region is a vast prehistoric domain of waterways, islands, seascapes, and shellscapes that stretch for some 100 miles along the southwest Florida coast. South Florida contains an immense wetland of marshes, swamps, rivers, and estuaries, dominated by the Everglades, the largest subtropical wetland in North America. The lower southwest coast contains the 10,000 Islands, a vast maze of lagoons, mangrove swamps, and marine meadows, comprising one of the most productive subtropical estuaries in North America. The region contains over 400 recorded shell midden sites. Shell middens take many forms, including small heaps, linear or mounded accumulations, and are traditionally viewed as either primary or secondary refuse, the results of daily refuse from domestic garbage accumulations. Another type of site are shellworks, a parallel term to earthwork. Shellworks are more than just large, happenstance shell midden accumulations. They were purposely constructed features, intentionally borrowed, piled, arranged, and formed into mounds, ridges, rings, platforms, and depressions. Shellworks suggest planned landscapes and terraforming to define public, domestic, sacred, and ceremonial spaces, suggesting that organized labor, community planning, and the ideological constructs of monumentality and ceremonialism shape these complex maritime cultural landscapes. This investigation offers the first large-scale settlement pattern of the region and employs the only holistic maritime landscape approach. To date, 15 shellwork complexes have been investigated, with over 200 radiocarbon dates generated for the region. Sites range from very small, less than half an acre, to architecturally non-complex ring-shaped middens, to massive sites comprising entire islands constructed from elaborate shellwork features, measuring up to 100 acres in extent. Comparison of shellwork forms throughout the region demonstrates significant similarities, including several recurring site forms such as ring-shaped features, mounds, and linear ridges. There are 13 major shellwork sites ranging in size from 30 to 100 acres in extent, which likely represent large nucleated villages. These sites occur with a regular spatial frequency. 8 of the largest sites occur every 3 to 4 miles within the northern part of the region and become less frequent towards the southern end of the region. 31 small shellwork sites and 12 shell rings are also present. The most well-known and northernmost of shellwork sites in the region was the Key Marco site, unfortunately now mostly destroyed by development. Here is Cushing's 1890s map digitized and brought into ArcGIS, which shows the site's occupants engineered the island landscape with shell, creating features such as radiating finger ridges, water courts, flat-top mounds, plazas, and canals. These shellwork constructions suggest organization and that of a planned maritime community. Another large shellwork site, Dismal Key, is a massive crescent-shaped shellwork island measuring 75 acres, containing shell mounds, ridges, plazas, canals, water courts, finger ridges, and seawalls. At the northern edge of the site is a small crescent-shaped shell ring, similar in size and shape to other southeastern shell rings, like we talked about this morning. South of the ring is the main portion of the site, which contains elaborate shellwork architecture, including extensive shell fields and a central district of shell mounds and ramps and canals. 2 6-meter-tall flat-top shell mounds are bisected by a long central canal leading into the center of the site, suggesting a high amount of coordinated labor to build and maintain a functioning canal. Archaeological testing determined that Dismal Key's inner shell ring is the earliest component of the site, was built rapidly, and dates to the Terminal Archaic. Testing of 4 of the largest flat-top shell mounds suggests that intensive mound building occurred between 580 and 900 AD. A series of shell-midden finger ridges at the west margins of the site are the most recently built features, dating from AD 990 to 1290. Terminal radiocarbonates and ceramic chronology suggest Dismal Key became abandoned just prior to AD 1300. Fakahatchee Key is a massive 98-acre shellwork site with several curvilinear or ring-shaped shell-midden ridges. Investigation determined it contained elaborate shellworks including mounds, platforms, water courts, canals, and radiating finger ridges. The curvilinear site plan of the site appears to be oriented towards the interior of the site, facing a low central area of shell fields and a large, flat, plaza-like area. Much like the Dismal Key site, the nested inner ring-shaped middens of the site were determined to be the earliest dated components of the site from BC 350 to AD 260. Also, the radiating finger ridges are the most recent features of the site, dating from AD 710 to 1280. Yeomans Mound is an isolated shell mound complex that appears to be purposely separated from the main portion of the site and is to be discussed later. In tandem with Dismal Key, Fakahatchee Key appears to be abandoned just prior to AD 1300. Survey mapping and testing of Sandfly Key shows a series of large nested crescents and rings. The earliest components of the site are the northernmost ring arms and 2 isolated sand and shell mounds, one of which dates to the transitional period between the late Archaic and early woodland. At the southern end of the site, Sandfly Key contains some shellwork features, including flat-top mound, possible house platforms, fish traps, canals, water courts, and extensive shell fields. The shellwork features date most recently, suggesting that over time, Sandfly Key residents shifted from constructing simple ring-shaped middens to construction of more elaborate shellwork features, suggesting an expanding community population and perhaps an increasingly complex social organization. Russell Key is a 60-acre site, and like other shellwork islands, is composed almost entirely of oyster shell. Like Dismal and Sandfly Keys, the northern end of the site contains a large, low shell ring almost completely buried under mangrove swamp, suggesting a post-occupational sea level rise. Testing of the shell ring suggests the ring is the earliest component of the site and likely has much deeper and earlier deposits, probably dating to late Archaic. South of the shell ring is the main portion of the site. It displays bilateral symmetry with a central plaza-like area. The central plaza is flanked on the east, west, and south sides of the site with a series of radiating shell finger ridges. The ridges occur in distinct groupings, suggesting that they were constructed as part of a planned, organized activity areas, residential zones, or habitation areas. Archaeological testing of these features indicates they were built rapidly and are contemporaneous. As is the pattern at all other shellwork sites, the radiating finger ridges at the southern edge of the site were determined to date most recently from about AD 900 to 1200. This suggests a regional temporal significance to these features, and that over time Russell Key inhabitants continually expanded the site in a southern seaward direction, constructing additional habitable landscape by continuing to build new site area out of shell. One of the most perplexing of shellwork features are basins or depressions found around the margins of many sites. Collectively called water courts, it is not yet known what these features function for. These features are almost always in association with finger ridges, suggesting perhaps some type of fish or shellfish storage or freshwater impoundment structure. Along the southern edge of the site is one single large water court, the largest found on Russell Key, measuring 15 by 50 meters. Radiocarbon dating places construction of this feature to around AD 1030 to 1290. The presence of one large water court may suggest a shift towards the centralization or control of resources, whether fish storage, water, or another function. Like the other large shellwork sites, Russell Key was abandoned by AD 1300. Today the site is thickly surrounded by mangroves. ArcGIS spatial analysis is used to model a 2-foot rise in sea level. With this scenario, the site appears more approachable by canoe, and one can visualize how some of the site's finger ridges and water courts may have looked and functioned. With a 2-meter high sea level rise, the long finger ridges are no longer encased in mangroves and are surrounded by water. The finger ridges likely functioned as canoe docks or jetties, or functioned as platforms for people to engage in group fish netting, with the nearby water courts functioning as temporary storage ponds. As this scaled outline of site forms shows, the shellworks demonstrate similar spatial and temporal patterns. Regionally, there are strong temporal similarities in site structures, forms, and layouts that imply nearby settlements must have been socially connected communities sharing similar social, political, and ideological characteristics that became manifested within their socially constructed landscapes. These constructed landscapes reflect a dynamic and recursive relationship with the environment, the sea, communities, and their shellscapes. Shellworks demonstrate not only a maritime cultural landscape that reflects changes in social organization over time, but that the landscape itself is a repository for social memory and history, and may be imbued with meaning and significance, connected to a larger system of monuments and ceremonial landscapes, seascapes, and shellscapes. For example, the Fakahatchee Key 3 site shows evidence of a possible ritual landscape suggested by the reappropriation of landscape features with the placement of a conical mound and 2 ramp projections superimposed on top of a much earlier, previously abandoned shell ring. This association or reappropriation of the earlier features suggests that the builders of the conical mound may have viewed their earlier shell ring feature with some kind of significance, perhaps reflecting a material persistence of memory that now marks the landscape. The mound may represent a communal mortuary monument, perhaps to memorialize ancestors, or it may mark a boundary, territory, or forbidden place for the settlement. A similar association is also found at Russell Key, with a flat-top mound and ramp superimposed on a much earlier shell ring. These mounds may be suggestive of monuments, which may have served a functional role, such as a special structure for elites or religious use, or served a more ontological, cosmological, or symbolic purpose. Sandfly Key is also suggestive of a ritualized or ceremonial landscape, with its pair of conical burial mounds out of view and deeply hidden within the mangrove swamp, surrounded by an extensive protective ring of shell midden and separated from the rest of the site by water. The hidden nature of the mounds suggests a sacred context, and their placement within a watery swamp may have further symbolic significance, as water is often viewed by Native Americans as sacred or a protective supernatural barrier or portal to another world. Lastly, the Yeomans Mound complex is another example of a ritual or sacred maritime landscape. The site contains a pair of 2 6-meter-tall conical shell mounds set along the edge of a ring or bowl-shaped midden within an arena-like complex. The interior is open and flat and is encircled by a raised ring of shell along its outer perimeter. At the southwestern edge of the site is a ramp of shell that gradually leads up into the complex, suggesting a directed entrance or perhaps a processional route into the complex. Its isolated position and separation by water also suggest secrecy or symbolic importance, purposely separated from the secular domestic areas of Fakahatchee Key. Human remains reported from the mounds and found within the plaza of the site suggest that it served special mortuary functions for the community. So in conclusion, the shellworks of the 10,000 Islands represent some of the largest and most complex prehistoric shell constructions in the world and are unique, preserved prehistoric landscapes that reflect important hunter-gatherer-fisher histories. These represent an exceptional example of a prehistoric maritime cultural landscape. Nomination of these sites as a maritime cultural landscape and as a National Historic Landmark would fill an important gap in documenting and understanding the important histories of prehistoric maritime peoples of the world. Thank you.